On today's show, slow and steady wins the race. It's an adage Brooklyn fans may not want to hear about the team's rebuild, but it's one they need to accept. I'll tell you why on today's episode of Locked On Nets.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to Locked On Nets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now the number one sports podcast network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is giving you a way to turn that energy into even bigger potential wins with a college basketball parlay profit boost. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel. Play your game. And on today's episode, it's Fan Take Friday. I took questions and takes from listeners on a wide range of subjects. Going to be a two-parter because we got another jam-packed mailbag. And part one, going to be talking about the Nets rebuild path, the Nets rebuild outlook, and specifically, how far away is this Nets team from competing, from potentially making a push for the playoffs? So first question, the Nets have shown what their rookies are capable of doing. Do you believe this team can actually make a play-in or even, may I say, a playoff push next season? That's from Justin Valdivi. And similar question, what are the chances the Nets make the playoff next year? How long do you think it's going to take for us to at least compete for a play-in spot at the minimum? That's from Johnson and also RJ. And yes, this is a question that I continuously have gotten throughout this season. You know, what is the outlook for next season? Can the Nets make the playoffs? What kind of a leap can we expect from them? And look, I think it's clear throughout this season that the Nets have a lot of promising pieces, like some of their rookies have shown promise. There's other guys, veterans, who I think are rotation caliber players. There's some middle of the road younger guys who I think have shown promise. But despite that, I'd say that Nets fans need to temper their expectations. I mean, this is a team that, had title aspirations, was a title favorite just 4 or 5 short years ago. And since then, it really has been 3 pretty painful seasons. Last year with the tanking season and the 2 kind of transitional seasons before that, it's been a, extended period. And despite that, the Nets are still early in this rebuild. Like, they kind of spent those 2 seasons in that transitional period where they were kind of trying to still go for it or still, be in a competitive playoff situation when they probably should have just ripped the Band-Aid off and tore it down. And they'd be a little bit further along in their rebuild if they had done that. But given that, this is year 2 of the Nets rebuild. It's really year 1 of the Nets rebuild because last year they didn't really have a lot of young pieces on this team that they were going to build forward with. This with the 5 rookie first-round picks, this is year 1 of a rebuild. And rebuilds take time, man. So if the question is, can the Nets make the playoffs next year? Look, I'm not going to put it past them and say they can't do it. They could get really aggressive. The answer to that question is ultimately going to be, how aggressive do they get in these offseason moves? How much, internal improvement do they get from the rookies this year? And how ready is the draft pick that they bring in? How ready is he to contribute to winning next year? So all of that, it hinges on those questions. But my perspective on it is that I do not think that the Nets are going to be a playoff team next year. I think that they could be much better, but I don't think they're going to be a playoff team. That's just based on the fact that, nearly half of the roster is going to be, 19, 20 years old or younger. Like, you look at it, they have 5 rookie first-round picks this year. They're bringing in another guy that's almost half the roster. And, very rarely in the NBA nowadays are sophomore players ready to contribute to, a playoff caliber rotation. Nets are going to have 5 of those guys. And I know that everybody's hyped off the fact that they're going to bring in potentially a top talent, a top 3 type talent. And there are guys, in that group who I do think can be significant needle movers even in their rookie season, but they're still rookies. It's very hard to contribute to winning, to elevate a team from one of the worst teams in the league to, a playoff, caliber team. It's very hard to do that for kids who are 19 years old. So, just based on where the Nets timeline is, I don't expect them to be a playoff team next year. I do think they can be much better. So the question is, can they be a play-in team? I definitely think that's a possibility. But ultimately, a lot of this is also going to depend on the moves that the Nets make outside of the draft. And that brings me to the next question. Do you think the Nets are going to contend next season or continue to rebuild? If we contend, how do you see a reworking of this roster going? That's from Pre-Selected Currency. And that's going to be a huge question because the Nets, obviously, there's been the storyline or the talking point that they don't own their first round pick next year. That is a swap that they owe to the Houston Rockets. So with that, they obviously don't have an incentive to tank. A lot of people saying, the Nets don't own their pick. They have to be better. They have to make the playoffs. They can't gift the Rockets another top pick. And that's not really the way that they should be operating. I've said this. That pick is a sunk cost. And Nets fans by now should know a lot about sunk costs. I mean, they've made several of these trades where they've given up, picks very far into the future. And does that mean that the Nets shouldn't try to be better? They should try to be better, but they should try to be better on their own terms. They should try to be better on their own timeline and, on their own, given their own incentives. That pick, I'm not naive. It's going to be an incentive. It's going to factor into their decision-making somewhat because optically, you don't want to give like the number 1 pick or, a top 3 pick again away, but it really shouldn't have any factor or calculus into their decision-making. So do I think the Nets are going to contend next season or continue to rebuild? They're not contending next season. I mean, these words are kind of semantics. They're going to be rebuilding. The question is, how much do they put the foot on the gas next season? That's the question. And do they mortgage some of maybe, what would be in their best long-term interest in terms of how they're building forward, mortgage some of the future capital to try to make some short-term gains? That's going to be the question. And I don't think that it would be, wise for them to do so. As I said, that pick is a sunk cost, and I think that they should be building at their own pace. We've seen the Nets do the quick fixes. We've seen them do it since Brooklyn. It's really all they've done. You had the D-Will trade into the KG Paul Pierce trade. You had the Big Three era, them going for that. I'm not saying that the Big Three era was necessarily a wrong move, but it was, the quick fix kind of mentality that we're putting it all together on the fly. And there's been a lack of continuity, a lack of, sustainable success, a lack of just overall structure and stability. And that's what this Nets team should be looking for. And that's going to come through building through the draft. And look, I understand the, temptation for Nets fans to question after, 3 disappointing seasons in a row, can they make the playoffs next year? I understand that. And I'm not saying that it's completely out of the question, but I'm saying you can find wins outside of necessarily making the playoffs. They're going to want to see improvement. They're going to want to hopefully maybe get into the play-in. Maybe that can be a goal, but that doesn't necessarily need to be like the end-all be-all if you're a fan. You can look for, is this going on a trend line where we can see it being sustainable and building in the right direction? I know that fans don't want to hear that right now, some fans, but that is what the Nets should be going for. So we'll see what, off-season moves they make outside of that. But I think that the focus about this rebuild, the focus of the Nets front office should have is building this out in a way that is the most sustainable way of building it, getting the most stability into this organization and putting forth, a structure and a framework and a baseline that you can build forward from, as opposed to trying to kind of mortgage the future, trying to get these short-term games when we know that that is not in the team's best interest based off of, previous experiences. And I said a lot of this is going to depend on the offseason moves in the next make. And next question, any realistic trade options this offseason? We don't have our pick next year, so it makes sense to finally take advantage of the cap space we've accumulated. I've heard the likes of Paolo Banchero floating around, so I'm hoping we make a push. And the next question also, would you try to trade for Paolo Banchero next season? That's from Langwood and Gunner99. And just on the question of what potential offseason moves can the Nets make, there's so many offseason moves that they can make. Like, it's right now, it's tough to even go to names or, name specific people. I think that you look at the avenues and the Nets are going to have to bring in talent. It's going to be the draft. They're obviously going to have a top pick in the draft. And then it's going to be the cap space that they have, free agency potentially, and then trades. And if you look at all of those routes, I'm not necessarily going to talk about so much specific players as I think they should target as the specific player, as the specific archetype or type of players that I think they should be targeting. And the way that I think that they should be going about it, look, if they wanted to bring a veteran in who they feel like can be a bridge guy who can kind of help this team take that next step, but not necessarily mortgage the future for him, I'm all in for that. And there's a lot of those buy low candidates that we've talked about throughout the season. The guys that I would like to see the Nets go after are some of, the buy low candidates, or, guys that are maybe younger, who they see in situations where maybe they don't have the potential to show all that they can right now. And the Nets maybe think with added opportunity, those kinds of guys can pop. And I think you look at a lot of the teams around the league. You look at the Oklahoma City Thunder, a team that has a surplus of talent. You look at, whatever other teams you want to name, whatever other contenders that have teams where they have guys that maybe necessarily aren't getting the opportunity that they would if they weren't on a contender along those lines. You can look at those guys. You can get those guys for, they'll still cost something, but you can get them on a discounted price, in the sense that maybe with added opportunity, they can show more or have more potential than they have in the position that they do right now. So those are the kind of moves that I would like to see the Nets make. And that, would be targeting younger guys who fit their timeline. It doesn't mean that they have to be 21, 22, 23 years old, but not going after, veterans who are getting to like kind of the prime or, approaching over the hill in their career. I don't think that makes sense unless you can get those guys at a very discounted rate. But guys who can fit the timeline, who maybe have potential to show more than they have been. And on the question of Paolo Banchero, I mean, could he be one of those guys? I'm not the biggest Paolo Banchero guy just based off of the amount that the Nets would potentially have to give up for him, the amount that he's making on his contract. I don't hate the idea. Like, I understand the appeal, but at the end of the day, he's a guy that really hasn't been that efficient offensively, struggles as a three-point shooter, has been a very high usage, ball dominant guy throughout his career. And I don't necessarily think that he's shown the offensive efficiency to warrant that. So I'm not totally out on it, but I'm not sure that that's the move that makes the most sense for the Nets. We got a lot of other questions about potential offseason moves. Jordi Fernandez, what does his coaching future look like? How does he factor into the way the Nets are going to build this team in the coming years? So we'll get into all that when I continue Locked On Nets after a quick break. College basketball is nonstop. Big games, tight spreads, momentum swings every single night. From early tip-offs to late-night West Coast shootouts, there's always action on the board. And now FanDuel is giving you a way to turn that energy into even bigger potential wins with a college basketball parlay profit boost. You can build any college hoops parlay you want, rivalry games, ranked matchups, whatever fits your read. You can mix spreads, totals, and player props to match how you see the slate playing out. Then you can apply the profit boost and instantly bump up the potential payout. Guys, go safe, go bold, ride with the team you've been following all season. It's your parlay, your style, now with more upside behind it. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel, play your game. Coming back from the break, continuing today's Locked On Nets episode on this Fan Take Friday, rolling on through all of your takes and questions. Next question. Assuming the Nets keep Yegor, Nolan, MPJ, or Clax, their first-round pick this year and their own first going forward, would you trade for Giannis? Or another way to ask, what is the trade package that would get Giannis without jeopardizing the future? That's from Hickson. So talking about a potential trade package for Giannis, a lot of questions about this throughout the year. You said assuming the Nets keep Yegor, Nolan, MPJ, or Clax, their first-round picks this year and their first-round picks going forward, what else do they have to trade? I mean, you got to give up something to get something. I mean, Giannis Antetokounmpo, I know that he's an older guy at this point. He's still a top 4 or 5 player in the league. You're not going to keep all of that and get Giannis. So if the question is, what is the trade package that could get Giannis without jeopardizing the future? I think that you look at the 2 premium assets the Nets have right now, Yegor Dioman, in terms of like the top young prospect that they have, Yegor Dioman, and their 2026 first-round pick. If the Nets are going into trade conversations, in my opinion, for Giannis, both of those assets should be off the table. You might not be able to get a deal done without including either of those assets. And if that's the case, you don't get a deal done. Like, that's fine. But if you're asking what's the package that the Nets could give up without jeopardizing their future, there really isn't one. No matter what the Nets do, in terms of a Giannis package, they're going to jeopardize their future because they're going to be giving up a boatload of draft picks. Like, that's just the bottom line. So if you're asking what is, the package for Giannis that the Nets could put together without completely mortgaging the future, I'd say, if you're trying to keep Yegor and you're trying to keep Nolan Troy, I would assume you want to keep MPJ if you're going after Giannis because you want to have that guy that he can play alongside. The package would be Nick Claxton as the main salary filler, Nolan Troy, maybe one other prospect or, player salary filler, like those guys in terms of the trade, and then a lot of first-round picks. It would be like 4 or 5 first-round picks plus swaps, and that is kind of mortgaging the future. It's not fully mortgaging the future. Like, you're kind of trying to do the 2 timeline thing in that scenario a little bit, which I don't think is prudent, but that's the kind of package that I could see. If you could get something, Clax, Nolan, maybe you just throw Terrence Mann in there as a salary filler and you give up a shitload of draft picks. That would be the package that I think would make at least some sense for the Nets. I don't think that it's something that they should do, but that's the package that wouldn't completely mortgage the future that you could at least have talks about if you're a team like the Bucks. Next question, who are some free agents or restricted free agents the Nets might look into acquiring this offseason? That's from Pino. And I have to go through the free agent list, but man, if you go through the free agent list, it's very dry. I mean, free agency, it's not what it used to be. I mean, it's more or less a thing of the past. And you look at some of the guys, like it's kind of similar to what I said with, kind of the younger guys that could potentially pop. You look at the RFAs that you can potentially overpay for and get them in the door. Like that is the most realistic route for Brooklyn. Like the star level guys hitting free agency, it doesn't happen anymore because guys are locking in their contracts first. And then if they want to change the scenery, they just ask out. That's how it's going now. But if you talk about free agents, like Peyton Watson with the Nuggets has been a guy that a lot of people have talked about because after trading for Cam Johnson and just with their financial situations, the Nuggets are going to be pushing up against the luxury tax, the aprons. They're going to have a hard time, with having to re-sign Cam Johnson potentially, with keeping a guy like Peyton Watson. So that's a guy that the Nets could go after and potentially overpay for and potentially kind of pry him away. And I think that if you're looking for, free agents that the Nets could realistically get, you kind of want to look at some of the apron teams. Like you look at the teams that are pressed up against the apron who have some young guys who are intriguing and they can't necessarily afford to overpay for those guys. So you talk about teams, like the Nuggets, you talk about teams like the Cavaliers, the Knicks, like those types of teams that are pressing up towards the aprons that can't afford. And you can kind of overpay slightly to take guys away from them because they don't have the financial flexibility to keep those guys. So I'm not getting into a ton of specific names. Tari Eason with the Houston Rockets, another guy that people have talked about, but I'm not sure the Rockets let him get out the door. But those are the types of players that I think the Nets will be looking for. And I think it's younger players who have potential, who, because the Nets have all of this financial flexibility, they have the luxury of time in their rebuild. You can afford to overpay for those guys a little bit to get them in your building, and pay them things that other teams cannot. So, other teams that are contenders right now cannot. So that's what I would say. And, I think we'll get into more specific guys as we get further along towards the offseason. Last question before another break. Is Jordi Fernandez the coach of the Nets 2 years from now? That's from Jeff Shapiro. And I think definitely yes. Like, I think that the Nets have had problems identifying coaches throughout this Brooklyn tenure. They've changed coaches like 9 times during this Brooklyn tenure. That's the main black mark, I think, on Sean Marks. After it seems like he kind of got pushed into firing Kenny Atkinson by the Stars, they really missed on the next 2 head coaches with Steve Nash and then Jacques Vaughn. And they wanted Ime Udoka. They didn't get him. But now it finally seems like they hit on a coach in Jordi Fernandez who has shown some really encouraging qualities during his first 2 seasons and has a plan in place that the Nets seem to wholly believe in. So if you're moving forward, the Nets just made 5 first-round picks in this last draft. They're going to make another top pick in this next draft. You're making those picks in the vision that Jordi Fernandez has set forth. Now, obviously, the Nets front office has their own vision. They have their own principles, but Jordi Fernandez is a big part. We heard all offseason about the collaboration between Jordi and the front office in regards to the draft process. So if that's the case, with the early returns, the promising returns that Jordi has shown through 2 tanking seasons, and with the amount that he is probably influencing, some of these picks, they're going to give him an extended runway to build out with the vision, that he sees fit and the front office sees fit. So I definitely think that Jordi will be the Nets coach 2 years from now. Last questions we got on this part 1 of the Fan Take Friday have to do with some of the current guys on the Nets team. Michael Porter Jr., Nick Claxton. Could they potentially be on the move this offseason? How should the Nets approach that? I'll get into all that when I close out Locked On Nets after a quick break. Welcome to the 5-hour energy flavor draft. We're looking at every aspect of the draft to let you know which tasty flavors are the best and which just might be sleepers. The board is set, the flavors are ready, and only one is going to take the top spot. Guys, 5-hour energy has a wide variety of flavors. They've got something for everyone. Some of my favorite flavors, Tropical Burst. It's tasty. It's got a fruity flow that gives off island vibes. Sour apple, crisp, tangy taste, delicious tart, just so good. There are other flavors that are definitely sleepers. Confetti Craze, Fruity Rainbow, Cotton Candy, whatever you like, they've got an option, and most of them are great. So find your new favorite flavor of 5-hour energy shots, available online at 5hourenergy.com or Amazon. Workplace chaos, deadline stacking up, inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill still sitting open. When the pressure's on and you need the right hire, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps you reach people who actually fit what you're looking for: skills, experience, location. So you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. And here's a stat that says it all. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less time, less stress, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? That's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, part 1 of this Fan Take Friday. Rolling on through all your remaining takes and questions. Next question. Sean Marks made a crucial mistake in not trading MPJ before the trade deadline. His value was at an all-time high with a potential 2 first-round pick return. Marks has a history of holding players too long and their value diminishes. Example, DFS. That's from Ethan Gans. And look, if you think that the Nets should have traded Michael Porter Jr. at this trade deadline, I could see why you would hold that opinion, but it's also difficult for fans to have that opinion without having any idea of what the market was or what the potential offers were. Like you put in this isn't a question. You put in this statement or this take, his value is at an all-time high with a potential 2 first-round pick return. And my response would be, how do you know? Like, you're not in front offices. You're not hearing all of the offers that the Nets had on the table. Maybe you are. Maybe, I don't know what kind of connections you have. But, it's tough to say that Mark should have traded him without knowing the potential return. So I would say that from things that I've heard, I've said this on this pod numerous times, the Nets weren't so much actively shopping Michael Porter Jr. They were trying to kind of, deal in a position of leverage. They were taking calls from a few interested teams. They had a high asking price. And I think that they had an asking price. And if that asking price was met, they probably would have traded MPJ, but they didn't. And they held him into the offseason. And the second point of Marks has a history of holding players too long and their value diminishes. Example, DFS. I talked about this on a recent podcast, and it's kind of, from my perspective, a weird take to have, because the last few trades, like the last few biggest trades that Sean Marks has made, he's knocked out of the park. And holding those players for an extended period was a big part of that. Whether you talk about the Kevin Durant trade, the Mikal Bridges trade, the Cam Johnson trade. And I just did a podcast about this earlier this week. And I said that the Michael Porter Jr. Cam Johnson trade, I think that the way the Nets handled that is going to inform the way that they handle this current situation. I think that it's a good comparison because I think that they're similar type players. They're older players. MPJ obviously younger than CJ in a rebuild, who were, had career seasons with the Nets. How do they handle that? And we heard a lot of the same messaging with Cam Johnson at last year's trade deadline that I did to Michael Porter Jr. at this year's trade deadline. So the Nets are going to go into the offseason. I think that they're going to get a sense of where their pick is, but I'd say that it's also easier to trade in the offseason. Teams have a better sense of where they are. There's more picks to be available to be traded around the draft. So I would say that, Michael Porter Jr., if you wanted the Nets to trade him at the deadline, I hear you, but I would say that I think that they're going to revisit trade conversations in the offseason. I do think that there's a decent chance that they get a good offer and that they will seriously consider it. And that brings me to the next question. What is the likelihood we see an MPJ or Nick Claxton trade come the offseason, in your opinion? That's from Blaine Rose. And starting on both of those, Michael Porter Jr., I would say I think that there's a decent to good chance that Michael Porter Jr. Could be traded during the offseason, because from things I've heard, the potential extension for Michael Porter Jr., the potential seeing him as a long-term fit, the Nets have put out that messaging that they do view him as a guy that they can build forward with. I've heard from some people kind of throwing cold water on that they see that this is the value, this is an all-time high potential value that they could get for him right now, and the potential of extending him and holding him, that might not be the way that the Nets are looking at this from things that I've heard. So I think there's a good chance that you could see a Michael Porter Jr. trade. In regard to Nick Claxton, I also think it's definitely a possibility. I mean, I've spoken about it. You look at it, you have Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe. I think at some point they're going to face a decision between those two guys. They don't have to, but I think that they will, be in a position where it will probably be prudent to decide between those two guys, because you have Claxton making, $21-22 million a year. Hopefully the Nets can extend Day'Ron because he's had a very good last 2 seasons. You can get him at a value contract, and you could keep both of them. I'm not saying it's out of the question, but I think with some of the limitations that Nick Claxton has shown, I'm just not sure if he's the center of the future for this team. So I could definitely see a Nick Claxton trade coming at some point, but it doesn't have to be this season, because we just talked about Sean Marks will hold guys, and Nick Claxton has 2 years left on his contract after this year. It is descending. I think that's part of the reason the Nets didn't trade Claxton this year's deadline, is because I think his deal is going to be more attractive in the last 2 years because it's descending. It's getting down to 13% of the cap next season and 11.5% of the cap in the final season. So the Nets could trade Nick Claxton this offseason, but they also don't have to. Like, there's no deadline on it. The Nets are also going to want to be better next season, and they have a lot of cap flexibility moving forward. So they could extend Day'Ron this offseason and have Nick Claxton and Day'Ron on the roster in the early portion of this rebuild. That's not going to hurt them long term. So I do think at some point we're going to see a decision made between Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe. And I'm not saying that means that Day'Ron Sharpe is going to be the starting center or the long-term option at center. I'm just saying, I don't think it's going to make sense to keep both of these guys, for the long haul moving forward. And with that, there could be a decision on Nick Claxton this offseason. It could be at the next trade deadline after that. It could be the following offseason after this coming offseason when Nick Claxton has 1 year left on his contract. So that's what I would say about that. Last question of this part 1. It seems your predominant stance on MPJ's future is a binary decision between trading or extending him this summer. Personally, I am rooting for the Nets to keep him given his positional size and proven capability playing alongside on-ball star creators. I think he's closer to the timeline than you give him credit for, given he's 27 and we can't field the team of all 21-year-olds if we hope to compete in the next few years. Shouldn't the Nets roll into his contract year unless they get a sweetheart extension value? That is from Ryan D. Yes, I've had a lot of comments on this. I think that, an extension for Michael Porter Jr., I haven't said I'm completely out on it, but I think that I'd be very wary of it, depending on what the number is. But if I'm MPJ's camp, I'm coming off a season where I was very close to making an all-star team. It was a career best season. I proved I can scale up in usage, be efficient for the majority of the season. I was healthy for the majority of the season. I think that they're going to be asking for a very big extension. Are they able to get it? Do they have leverage? That's another conversation. But I just think that if you're the Nets, for me, it's not that I necessarily think that he can't fit the timeline. He's 27. He's going to be 28 next season. It's young enough. He could be like a bridge guy for sure. For me, it's the opportunity cost and it's the risk associated with keeping MPJ and extending him. And if you're talking about, answering the primary part of your question, if you're talking about should the Nets just roll into his contract year without trading him or without extending him, I don't think so. I think that you're going to want to cash in for him. Can they trade him at the deadline potentially? Sure. But I wouldn't get into the following offseason after this coming offseason without trading him or extending him. That would be a major risk. And I don't think that would make any sense whatsoever. So to me, there is a question of you either trade him in the next couple of transaction cycles, or you extend him. And if I'm the Nets, just given the risk associated with extending him, we've seen MPJ. He had a really good year this year. He was very efficient. He had an impact on winning, earlier in the season. We're seeing it taper off as of late. So there's going to be the question, how much do you weigh the first half of the season versus the second half of the season? There's also the injury concerns and the timeline concerns. He's going to be 28 years old. He's young enough, but he's still an older guy who has had 3 back surgeries throughout his career. There's no guarantee that he's going to age well or be healthy, moving forward. So that's a big risk. And then you couple that risk with the opportunity cost and the sense that this is probably the highest his trade value is ever going to get, just from the sense of he only has 1 year left on his deal. There's going to be teams who are able to get to that number and able to take him on without necessarily, making a huge long-term commitment. And also he's coming off of a career best season. He had a really good year this year. So is his trade value ever going to be more valuable than it is right now? If you extend him on an exorbitant number, is his trade value going to be more value then once you get further into the deal and he's older? I don't think so. So I just think that if I'm the Nets making a decision on MPJ, unless they have a lot of conviction that he's the guy he's a guy, a main guy that they want to be one of the highest paid players on their roster for the next few seasons. And they're comfortable with that. They have all the medicals. They think that, that's a route that could give them success. Sure, you can do it then. But outside of that, I mean, if you have any reservations, the value is probably not going to be higher than it is right now. So that would be a guy who I would seriously consider trading. And I think that that's not because I don't like Michael Porter Jr. as a player. I think that he's proven that he can be a winner. I think he brings a lot of valuable things to the table. It's just where the Nets are at in their timeline. You do need some good players, but you would like those players to fit the timeline a little bit better and not to have significant injury histories and not there to be still questions about what his capabilities are offensively in terms of, how he can be like a driver of offense. Is he more of a behind the scenes guy? How can he do this in a number one role long-term? Like a lot of those questions, despite some of the things that Michael Porter Jr. did during the first half of this season, they are questions. But that's all I got for you guys on part 1 of this Fan Take Friday. If you guys do not already, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you enjoy my content, take a second right now, smash that like button, leave a comment, leave a 5-star review. Anything you can do to engage is much appreciated. But I got part 2 of this week's Fan Take Friday coming. I'm going to talk about some of the Nets rookies, some of their 2026 draft possibilities. So again, to all that when I'm back tomorrow, talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.